Hello, BookTube. I'm doing an extended apology tour here on BookTube where I'm touching base with all of the events that I'm either wanting to announce or wanting to participate in or wanting to continue or even hosting. I've been letting a lot of things slide. I've been having a lot of fun on BookTube, but I've been letting a lot of things slide. So I thought better to clear them up all at once than to just do it piecemeal. So that's what I'm doing for this weekend. I'm hoping that by the end of the weekend, I will, through Herculean effort, have managed to cover everything while also doing regular original videos for my channel. I'm hoping that I can, and then maybe I'll take a breather on Monday. Not no videos, I mean, but only 4. Something like that. And the event that I want to talk about in this video is February Fantasy Stories, FFS, which originated with the Bookish Bryants, as a lot of really good annual BookTube events have, designed to concentrate on fantasy reading, and specifically shorter works. The original conception of February Fantasy Stories to put the emphasis on stories. You were supposed to read things under 220 pages, thereabouts, shorter works. I was enthusiastically involved with February Fantasy Stories last year, and this year the Bookish Bryants were going to give it a miss because they had an alien invasion, they had giant groundworms, they had a zombie apocalypse, or whatever. And there's the whole of their normal world collapsed in on them. I thought something's got to give here. But then they graciously allowed me to sort of zombie host their own event with February Fantasy Stories on my own. And then I dropped the ball. I haven't made any February Fantasy Story videos since I announced that I was taking over the event. I'm going to try to make up for that in the next half of the month of February. That's one change in February Fantasy Stories. And the other change is not official. Of course, I am not violating the essential integrity of their event. It is still 220 pages or less, fantasy shorter works. But if you watch my channel, you already know I like bigger books. I like longer works. The longer the better. Unless it's junk. I like the longer the better. So maybe for this Steve iteration of February Fantasy Stories, maybe the Bookish Brides will forgive me if I loosen that requirement just a bit, just a bit. If you want to read a longer work in February Fantasy, I mean it was perfectly permissible last year. This is friendly, right? This is all friendly and voluntary. But if you want to read a longer work this year, that's fine by me. I have books that I want to show you. Works of fantasy in February, some of which I have read and some of which I am going to read. And I will start with this. This is by Shannon Chakraborty, who did the City of Brass trilogy that I just loved. I thought that trilogy was fantastic. And she's starting a new trilogy with really good cover art for the first volume. This is The Adventures of Amina Alsarafi. Look at that cover. Maybe I'm just partial to tentacles, but that is just great. And this is the first book in a series that, from its description, sounds like take the fantasy-fueled backdrop of The Adventures of Sinbad and change every single character of any kind anywhere in the story into a woman who hates men. Now, I'm hoping that that's not the case. I'm hoping that's just the description, because I'm getting a little tired of that kind of Twitter posturing in the fiction that I'm reading. And I think a lot of readers are getting tired of it too. It's brainless and adolescent. It's angry without a purpose. It's ridiculous. So I'm hoping that that's just the cover copy and that the book is actually as good as City of Brass, as all of those novels were fantastic. If this is a continuation of the fun that the author was having narratively in that trilogy, then I'm all on board. I'm all on board completely. Like so many people who are getting tired of that kind of strident, woke scolding in their fiction, I have nothing against main female characters. I have nothing against a narrative based entirely around female characters. I really liked The Prior of the Orange Tree. Didn't make a point of it. I didn't care. It was so well done, and it wasn't yelling at me, that I ranked it very highly at the end of my year. Like so many people who are tired of being scolded about these things in the prose of the books they're reading for fun, having given the author their money, all I want is for it not to be hectoring. You base a story around it, not a political campaign around it. I'm hoping that that is the case here. I will report back. I will let you know. Then another fantasy story that I will read for February In fact, I think I will read it this weekend. I have it, so I think I will read it. I was kind of waiting for the finished copy, but when it comes to a big work of fantasy, you don't really need to wait for the finished copy here. It's not like I'm going to be checking, the index and the bibliography in the back of a big fantasy novel. So probably I will just read it this weekend. This is the second book in the Moonfall series by James Rollins. This is The Cradle of Ice. It's third bigger than the first book. And I really like the first book. It's pure epic fantasy in the good ways and the bad ways. It's got all the adventure and the escapism of epic fantasy, and it also has all the intense predictability. When I say pure, I also mean stereotypical in this case. The author is not trying to rewrite the book on epic fantasy at all. And this is a story of a character named, there are a lot of characters in here. There's a character named Nyx who discovers something that some of the powers that be in her world, which is called Earth, Urth, already know and are not letting be known to the public for obvious reasons, which is that the moon seems to be falling out of the sky. Not happening at a blistering pace, but something fundamental seems to be happening. And it could be catastrophic for the world. And as you could predict, the plot line of that first book is that the character realizes that, and immediately that starts a path of adventures. And the neatest thing about the first book is that those adventures immediately expand into a really good core cast of characters. About half a dozen, maybe one or two more than that, cast of characters that are unpredictable and really interesting. There's a Doctor Doom style villain who I imagine will have a very prominent part in this book, and will probably be, he was in many ways the most enjoyable part of the first book. He'll probably be even more so now, because now he has, I don't want to spoil anything, but he has a very visible extra reason to be evil, to be mad at everybody. Now, in this book he does. And also something was found, an object, there's always a MacGuffin, was found in the first book of Moonfall. And unlike as is usually true, the MacGuffin that was found is very powerful. Yes, that's normal, but it's also alive, and it has quite an attitude. And that will also be a prominent part of this book. But there are another character in here is Prince, I say his name Kanthi, Kanthe. And he's connected to the bad guy, and he's pretty enjoyable. He has a good character arc, better, I think, than Nyx's. And the reason I'm stressing the characters here instead of the action is because this second book, Rollins decides to split the cast. So for the bulk of the book, I gather, we'll be dealing with a handful of main characters in one end of the world, and a handful of main characters at the other end of the world. I don't know if they'll be brought back together in this middle book. It could be that Rollins is such a Lord of the Rings fan that he's not going to bring his main cast together until the end of the third book. Either way, I really like the first one. I am really looking forward to this one. So that's my other fantasy pick. And then my third fantasy pick, these will not be the only fantasies that I read for the rest of February, but my third one is something for the gays. You got to have something for the gays. And this fits one of my prompts. I actually gave prompts for this month, back when I thought I was going to be a conscientious host. I said classic sword and sorcery. I said epic fantasy. There's a little bit of disobedience with the Brooker's Brides. You can read an epic fantasy if you want for the month. Also, installment. You can read, book number 2, number 3, number 10 in a series, and also modern. And by modern, I meant not necessarily urban. I think it shows the kind of snobbery of the East Coast, West Coast publishing world to say that if anything is modern, it must be urban. It's true that most people live in cities, but a lot of people don't, and they're still modern. there are satellite dishes all over the United States, including in a lot of towns that I would love to live in if I didn't love Boston so much. So modern doesn't have to be urban, but it can't be the neo-medieval agrarian horse-driven world that was where the pattern was set with the Lord of the Rings, and it's just stayed true. It can't be that. I'm doing epic here. The Chakraborty book will certainly be epic. I'm doing installment. The Chakraborty book is installment number 1. The second Moonfall book is installment number 2. And now I'm doing modern as well. This is by Jordan Castillo Prince, and it's called The Tinker's Apprentice. And there's our main, I'm presuming that's our main character, Conrad, who is this is magic in a modern setting. and he works in a magic shop, and he's not really sure what he wants to do. He's not really sure what shape his magic should take, hence all those different choices on the cover. What will be his magic instrument? Will it be a magic hammer, power saw, a power drill? What will it be? What will be the way? He's a little bit bumbling, a little bit unsure of himself. In that case, a stereotypical template for the fantasy hero. And according to what I remember from the description, his magic shop world is upended because there's a big Barnes & Noble Amazon-style chain of magic stores called Magimart that moves in and starts putting the mom-and-pop magic shops out of business. And he has to figure out how to deal with that, but also there's budding romance. There's another fella who may or may not impart Conrad with the enthusiasm that he needs to find his art, to find his magic. We'll see. From what I read about the premise of this thing, its success with me will entirely be about the author's sense of humor. If this is all slang, all TikTok, and F-bombs on every other sentence, then I probably won't enjoy it. If it's as charming as its setup sounds, well, then I will probably enjoy it. And I will report back. Those are the new books for February Fantasy Stories. But I have been reading fantasy, even though I've been ruthlessly ignoring my own event. And I wanted to show you two of the things that I've read in fantasy this month. They're both rereads, but a long time has passed in both cases. I think they could almost count as reads. The first one was this, Elie Modesitt's book, The Magic of Recluse. The first book in this enormous series of his, set on an island with mage lords who induct ordinary people into their ranks and fight against the forces of supernatural. It's very, very expectable. A lot like the Rollins series. This is very predictable epic fantasy. And it has this great cover, a carriage mired in mud in the rain. Just fantastic. You don't quite know what you've got there. It's a prosaic moment, but it works well for a cover. This is Darrell K. Sweet, I believe, or Michael Whelan, one of the two. I think this is, well, anyway. This is the first book in the series. And I'm willing to cut first books in the series a lot of slack. Because they've got a lot of work to do. A lot of world building has to happen in that book, and world building is, in the hands of most writers, is not very interesting. I understand that. I understand that completely. I did the Belgariad, right, last year, so I'm well aware of that. But, first of all, in this reread, when did this originally come out? I want to say the 1990s. 1991. First of all, the world building here happens way too slow. On page, I noted, because on page 180, we're still talking about the basics of order versus chaos in this magic system. Could have been handled in two well-done paragraphs 100 pages before. Almost 200 pages before. So the world building happens way too slow. And I don't know if that's because it's underestimating the intelligence of the reader, or maybe the author is just kind of boring. In addition to that, in addition to the world building in the first book, you also have to have an ingenue. You have to have someone like Conrad. You have to have someone like Nyx in the first Moonfall book is not exactly an innocent. She's pretty smart. She's pretty sharp. But you have to have an everyman character. You have to have a focal character for your readers to enter into the world. Typically speaking, in epic fantasy, that is, the stereotypical farm boy. The person who's never been out of their little town. The person who's a little bored with their little town, has never been out of it, and suddenly is the chosen one or marked out or has some sort of unexpected supernatural capacity of one kind or another, a supernatural duty. That writers sometimes don't stray far from that template at all. The Belgariad is exactly like that, and so is this book. And the main character that we meet in this book, when he's, I think, 15, has never been out of his boring little town. And imagine the magic setup here is a quiet little town from Beauty and the Beast. And maybe our main character is Belle, but the boringness of the town has been imposed on it by the Brotherhood, by the magic users of the world have come to the conclusion, and it's explained to our main character later on in the book, far too later on in the book, that if you have complete order like that, completely boring, completely predictable, complete order, you won't have any of the bad stuff that comes with chaos. And that's okay as a worldview. That's interesting. You can explain that, definitely. The problem here is the main character, who's a jerk. He's not just dumb, and he's not just a yokel whose world borders are so narrow that he's constantly expanding them as he meets new strangers and learns more about his magic staff and his magic abilities. It's not just that. It's that stubbornly, persistently, until 2/3 of the way into the book, he's not just a country yokel, he's an a-hole. And there's a dividing line between those two that the writer should have been able to pick that out, unless, I actually don't know that much about Elie Modesitt as a writer. It could be that that was intentional, that this writer's having a little fun at the expense of the usual conventions of epic fantasy. But like, for instance, once the main character is inducted into the academy where he will train for the Danger Guild and become part of these magic users in the world, he has an instructor. Brother Cassius is instructing him on the ways of order and chaos and whatnot, and talks about the price that you pay for chaos. In the next kingdom over that isn't quite so boring and regular as your hometown, people starve to death because warlords have blocked the roads for their own petty reasons, and so grain can't get in. So people starve to death. And at one point, the main character is saying, well, okay, so warlords do that. So what? That's human nature. And you're thinking, all right, well, that's kind of unfeeling on your part, especially since none of your other classmates are that kind of a douche canoe. But then he gets to the specific point that Brother Cassius is making about how that kind of chaos can cause people to starve to death. And without missing a beat, the main character says, oh, people starve to death all the time. So what? And at that point, I'm saying, well, screw you. I don't want to read your adventures. That's not being a country yokel. That's being a psychopath. And that note is carried way too far. Over and over again in this book, the main character, who is a young man for most of the action, doesn't sound like one at all. He sounds like not only a 50-year-old man, but a 50-year-old drunk at the end of the bar that you hate. So this reread was not enjoyable. I got this mass market. When did I get this? I got this mass market here. I hauled it on this channel, and I actually thought when I found it that I might go through all of the Recluse books. Now I don't feel like doing that at all. I might, if I find the second one with the original. I wanted the original mass market, and I wanted it with the original cover artwork. And I think I remember years ago, maybe last year, at the beginning of last year, or something like that, I remember just idly going to eBay to look for a mass market paperback of this, and they were absurdly expensive. So I said, the Brattle will provide. Sooner or later, I will find a dollar copy of this, and I did. And I know that will happen with book 2, but I don't know that I want to go on to book 2. This, as a reread for FFS, that wasn't all that successful. But my second reread was very successful. I don't remember enjoying this nearly as much the first time I read it. And it's this. It's Conan, the Road of Kings by Karl Edward Wagner. A Conan pastiche novel made in this series. For a little while, Bantam did these and they numbered them. They gave that up. They kept doing the Conan pastiche novels. Lots of them. Dozens of them. But they gave up the uniform cover design with the number. They stopped doing that. And they certainly stopped doing this. The first 5 or 6 of these had this very expensive feature of a fold-out poster in the book. Here's Conan facing off against a giant metal, non-human creature. How's Conan possibly going to be able to beat that thing? This is kind of neat. There's kind of a neat feature. I have 5 of these that Bantam did, and I don't know if they made a 6th one. But they're all like that. And I'm not 100% sure that I would have gone into this with my antenna quite so up for whether or not it was any good. If the last time I read this book, BookTube did not exist. And now BookTube does, and Karl Edward Wagner has an indefatigable advocate in Michael K. Vaughan, who really likes his work. He actually sent me back to the Kane books. Karl Edward Wagner's signature original character is a sword and sorcerer named Kane. And I went back to, I think, 2 Kane novels. I found them right away, mass market paperbacks at the Brattle, and felt a little guilty because Mike goes on about how much he loves the books, and I didn't like them much at all. By the time I was halfway through the second one, I was kind of eager for it to be over. When I reread this, I was a little bit trepidatious, but now I see what the problem is. I don't like Kane. That's the problem, is that I don't like Kane. When Karl Edward Wagner writes Conan the Barbarian, in this case a young Conan, who is facing the world and he is faced with being hanged by the neck until dead on page 2. All the adventures happen from there. Falls in with a band of thieves, faces off against all kinds of evils. You know perfectly well that the thieves are going to turn on him as well. Karl Edward Wagner writes this so well. Now, you might think, all right, I love this book. I'm back in Michael K. Vaughan's good graces because of how much I loved Karl Edward Wagner writing Robert E. Howard's signature character. So you might think that we're okay now. The things are okay between us, but they're not. They're not. Because I wasn't halfway through this book before I was thinking, not only is this much better than Karl Edward Wagner's Kane novels, this is also a lot better than Robert E. Howard's Conan novels. And there you go. There's the peace and amity between me and Michael K. Vaughan. Out the window again. It was calm for a moment. Now it's gone again. And I wanted to read you just a bit before we wrap up. Just a bit. This thing has. This is just a delightful story. It has these dorky little black and white illustrations throughout, in addition to the poster. But at one point, Conan and his beauteous female companion, Thief, are assured by their thief leader that the very man-like statues, the thing that's on the cover here, that are down guarding the subterranean entrance to a rumored treasure hoard, they're completely harmless. They're not ensorcelled in any way. You can just swim right by them. And it turns out that that's not true. The female companion's name is Sandakazi. And we're told this. Let's see here. Kalidios is the name of the thief lord. Fantastic riches might lie within the drowned barrow, but these were safe from any thief who lacked gills. No wonder Kalidios had sought help in despoiling this tomb he had discovered. Sandokazi swam past him, that's Conan, for a better look at the Stygian's discovery. Her tanned legs thrust powerfully as she reached the mouth of the passage and hovered close to the foremost of the stone warriors. The statue's arm shot out. An onyx fist closed upon her shift. How much do you want to make a bet the shift doesn't make it through the scene? Sandokazi had started for the surface. She glanced down to see what her shift had caught upon. A scream stole a torrent of bubbles from her mouth. Holding Sandokazi fast, the statue lifted a stone mace in its other hand, dragged the struggling girl toward itself. Scarcely slowed by the enveloping sea, the mace swept down for her head in a killing blow. Not losing time to seek to comprehend, Conan drew his knife and lunged downward for the writhing figure of the girl. Catching her by the shoulder, he jerked her body aside just as the mace slashed past them. From the corner of his eye, Conan saw that another of the black stone figures was turning towards them. Sea muck churned from half-buried legs as it shuddered forth from the passage, onyx sword raised to strike. The trail of bubbles from Sandokazi's mouth ceased as her limbs thrashed in helpless frenzy. Conan's knife stabbed against the black arm that pinioned her. Its steel blade skidded harmlessly against adamantine stone. The mace smashed towards him. Conan doubled up, evaded the blow, kicking savagely against the stone shoulder in an attempt to drag free. The girl's cotton shift tore apart in the struggle, freeing her abruptly. Under the impetus of his thrust, Conan flung away from the stone warrior, clutching Sandokazi's naked form, as one does. Holding the half-drowned girl in his arms, Conan kicked frantically towards the surface. He risked one quick glance downward. The stone warrior glanced upward at them from the tunnel mouth, mace upraised, and a rag of Sandokazi's shift in the other black fist, proof that this had not been some nightmarish delusion of the depths. Conan broke water. Sandokazi retched and fought for breath, still struggling in mindless panic. "Kalidios, you treacherous bastard!" Conan snarled. "You knew those things were alive. Why didn't you warn us?" "I knew they'd start to move when you approached them," the Stygian defended himself. "But they're far too heavy to swim up after us, and after all, I never thought you'd be careless enough to swim within their reach." The whole book is just a rollicking, fun adventure story. It has none of the portentousness that this author brings to his own creation. I loved it. Just loved it. So I had a hit and a miss for the books that I've read so far for February Fantasy Stories. I'm going to keep going, not only with older rereads, but with those 3 new books. And now, of course, I encourage you all to do it as well. Just because your host has been dilatory doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing the event. It shouldn't be just Jacob Phillips who's carrying the torch here. It should be all of us reading fantasy stories for February. Although I am also doing a read-along of the Two Towers. That surely gets me out of the doghouse just a little. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. That's February Fantasy Stories. I will check in before the end of the month. And I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.